Imagine meeting someone thousands of years ago. There are no dating apps, no wedding rings, no love letters, no photographs, and yet you might have formed a bond with that person that lasted for years or even a lifetime. But here's the strange question. When did humans first fall in love? Was it 10,000 years ago? 100,000 years ago? Or did something resembling romantic attachment exist long before our species even appeared? The surprising answer is that scientists can't give us a date, but they can look for traces. And some of those traces are buried in ancient graves, hidden inside DNA, and preserved in the way prehistoric people lived and died. The first problem is that love doesn't fossilize. Bones can survive. Stone tools can survive. Sometimes even DNA can survive. But emotions don't leave a clear archaeological signature. An archaeologist can find two people buried near each other. But that doesn't automatically mean they were lovers. They could have been siblings, parent and child, members of the same community, or simply people who were buried according to the same cultural tradition. So when scientists ask about prehistoric love, they're really asking a different question. What evidence can tell us that ancient humans formed strong, lasting social bonds? And that's where archaeology gets interesting. One of the most powerful clues comes from ancient burials. For thousands of years, humans have deliberately buried their dead. And sometimes, the arrangement of those burials tells us something about how people understood their relationships. But there's an important catch. A burial position isn't a direct window into someone's emotions. Instead, archaeologists combine several kinds of evidence. Who was buried together? How were they related? Were they buried at the same time? What objects accompanied them? And increasingly, what does their DNA tell us? This is changing what we can learn about prehistoric communities. At Hazelton North in Britain, researchers analyzed the DNA of people buried in a Neolithic tomb dating to roughly 5,700 years ago. They reconstructed a 5-generation family tree. And the results showed that burial practices were connected to complicated patterns of biological and social relationships. Even more interestingly, some people buried with the family were not closely related biologically. That suggests that prehistoric communities could recognize relationships that weren't simply based on shared DNA. Ancient DNA has completely changed this investigation. Imagine trying to understand a prehistoric village using only bones. You might know that dozens of people lived there, but you wouldn't necessarily know who was related to whom. Now scientists can sometimes reconstruct those relationships genetically. And suddenly, an archaeological site becomes something much more personal. You can identify parents, children, siblings, more distant relatives, and entire family networks. A 2023 study reconstructed an extended prehistoric family at a burial site in France, revealing relationships across multiple generations. This doesn't tell us these two people were in love, but it gives us something almost as important. It reveals the social world in which relationships existed. And that raises another question. If humans were forming complex family and social networks thousands of years ago, how much older could these behaviors be? This is where things become much harder. The best preserved family evidence often comes from relatively recent prehistoric societies. But humans existed for hundreds of thousands of years before farming and permanent settlements became widespread. What about them? For hunter-gatherer societies, we have fewer direct clues. There are no written descriptions of relationships, no marriage certificates, no personal diaries. Instead, researchers have to combine archaeology with anthropology, genetics, and evolutionary biology. Scientists studying human evolution have proposed that pair bonding may have provided advantages in raising children and maintaining social relationships. But this doesn't mean prehistoric humans had exactly the same concept of romance that we have today. Love is a modern word for a complicated collection of emotions and behaviors. Attachment, attraction, trust, cooperation, jealousy, affection, commitment. These don't necessarily appear at the same moment in evolution. And then we reach one of the most fascinating parts of the story: Neanderthals. For a long time, popular culture portrayed Neanderthals as primitive creatures completely separate from us. But genetics destroyed that simple picture. We now know that Neanderthals and modern humans interacted and had offspring. We also know that different ancient human groups interacted with one another. In fact, research published in 2026 provided evidence suggesting an even older human-relative interaction. Proteins from approximately 400,000-year-old Homo erectus teeth were used to investigate a possible connection with Denisovans. But here's the important distinction. Having offspring doesn't prove romantic love. It tells us that different human populations encountered one another and reproduced. The emotional story behind those encounters remains unknown. And that's exactly why this subject is so fascinating. So can we actually answer the question? When did humans first fall in love? Not precisely. There probably wasn't a single moment when love suddenly appeared. Human relationships evolved gradually. Our ancestors already lived in social groups. They cared for children. They cooperated. They depended on one another. Over enormous periods of time, those behaviors could have interacted with attraction, attachment, cooperation, and family relationships. Eventually, human societies developed increasingly complex systems of kinship and partnership. But archaeology can't look at a 100,000-year-old skeleton and say, "This person was in love." That would go beyond the evidence. What archaeology can show us is something more subtle. Humans repeatedly invested enormous effort in other humans. They cared for injured members of their groups. They buried their dead. They maintained family relationships across generations. And they built social systems around those connections. Maybe that's the real answer. The first human love story probably wasn't written down. There was no author, no photograph, no monument. Maybe it was simply two people choosing to stay close to one another. And then, thousands of years later, all that remains is a fragment of bone, a burial, a genetic connection, or a trace in the archaeological record. We will probably never know exactly what those people felt. But we can see evidence that humans have been building complicated relationships with one another for an extraordinarily long time. So perhaps the better question isn't, when did humans first fall in love? It's, how far back can we trace the human need to form bonds with other people? And that story may be much older than civilization itself.